Welcome, everyone. Just let everybody have a chance to get logged in and connected to your sound. We're really thrilled that you could join us today for our first of a series of webinars during this Black History Month. And we're going to focus on a fascinating story of a 19th and 20th century figure that is very little known. And the story is called The Black Russian, as you all know, because you registered for the Black Russian webinar. So I just like to always start these presentations by learning a little bit about who's in the audience. And it would be wonderful if you have the opportunity to use the chat feature and just tell us your name and your Yale affiliation and where you are zooming in from today. Would be wonderful for Professor Alexandrov to know who's here as well. So please feel free to use the chat and just introduce yourself. What made you interested in coming to the session today? Did you read the book yet? Do you have a copy of the book? Did you read it? What did you think? So please do take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat if you have that opportunity. Hi to Lisa, Yale College class of 77 in Portland, Oregon. All right, Lisa, welcome. Nice to have you. And Ram, MS 78 from Rochester. Pierce, class of 62 from Berkeley. Susan, American Studies, PhD, class of 85 from Providence, I believe it was. All right, all the introductions are coming in. A lot of them coming in quickly all at once. Let's see who else is here. Don from Jacksonville, Florida, didn't read the book. And alum, oh, Donna, PhD in psychology, class of 76. And Al Angel, class of law school, class of 60 from Manhattan. Nice, welcome. Hi to Kathy in Cambridge, class of 76, and John, class of 62 in Gaithersburg. Hi, Allison, Yale College class of 95, zooming in from Pelham, New York. Wonderful to have you here. And Sharon, my neighbor at Yale School of Management in New Haven. Danny, Berkeley, did Russian Studies, class of 80. And Dennis, class of 77, Santa Rosa, California. Hi to Martha, SOM 89. In West Warwick, Rhode Island, who was an undergrad Russian major and plays in jazz bands. So she has a lot in common with the themes today. Matthew from Bowie, Maryland, PC 2019, and interested in learning about this interesting story in the humanities. Absolutely it is. Hi to Rena, class of 79 from Israel. All right, Rena, so far you are the person who's zooming in from the greatest distance. But do feel free to tell us where you are. It's always nice to know where everyone's coming from. Hi to Robert Jackson, Professor Emeritus of Russian Literature at Yale. So, all right, Professor Alexandrov, some of your colleagues are showing up today, which is great to see you all. Hi to Sandra, Yale Law School in New York City. And Bill, retired physician, Yale College class of 1970, has property in Mississippi. So one of the things I loved about this book was just finding out more about perspectives on Mississippi that I had no idea. A lot of us don't know enough about Mississippi, and there certainly is a lot to learn, but the history in this book is just fantastic. Hi to Alexandra, Yale College class of 80 in Zurich, Switzerland. All right, we're getting the overseas folks shouting out their countries as well. That's great to see. Lewis from Lake Elsinore, California, who plans to read the book, class of 77, all right. And Wilson, class of 77 in Utah. Oh, we got a lot of you all from the West Coast here. That's great. Hi to John, graduate school 68 from Las Vegas, hasn't read the book yet. And Kathy Leinhart, class of 84, BA in Russian Studies in Maryland in 97. Oh, MD in 97, sorry. And living in Orange, Connecticut and working at Yale Health. Oh, wonderful, Kathy. So great to have you. And hi to Ruth, who is a Yale College parent. We'd love to have the parents and the grandparents on our Yale Alumni Academy programs. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for introducing yourselves. It looks like we're hitting a steady number of people, and so many of you have shouted out where you're from, and that's really wonderful for Professor Alexandrov to know everyone who's here. Elvis, I see you, Davenport 93 in North Carolina, former president of the Yale Russian Chorus. So Professor Alexandrov, your Russian, passionate Russian students are turning up all around the world. So that's really wonderful. I'm going to get us started and introduce our speaker today. It is just a pleasure. We did a session last year as well with Professor Alexandrov, so it's a pleasure to have you back. Last year we spoke about Boris Savinkov and your book, To Break Russia's Chains. So if you haven't seen that presentation and you're interested in the Russian theme, I encourage you to visit the Yale Alumni Academy website and take a look at our last webinar with Professor Alexandrov. And he's back now in honor of Black History Month to talk about the book, The Black Russian. Professor Alexandrov grew up in New York City in a Russian immigrant family, planning to be a scientist from an early age. And however, when he got his bachelor's and master's degrees in geology, he decided to study literature and the humanities, resulting in a PhD in comparative literature from Princeton. After teaching in the Slavic department at Harvard, he moved to Yale's Slavic department in 1986, where he taught undergraduate and graduate courses on 19th and 20th century Russian literature and culture, including on Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Nabokov, Belly, and others, other writers and topics. He retired in 2018 to write full-time. Now, while preparing to teach a graduate seminar on Russian emigre and culture, he discovered Frederick Bruce Thomas, and he wrote The Black Russian about this African-American who led an extraordinary life in Russia and Turkey in the early part of the 20th century. This book is now being developed into a dramatic TV series. He then turned his attention to the controversial Russian revolutionary I mentioned earlier, Boris Savinkov, and he wrote the book To Break Russia's Chains. Professor Alexandrov has written several other books, including Limits to Interpretation, The Meanings of Anna Karenina, and his next project will focus on Lincoln and Russia. That one we'll have to have you back again to discuss. That sounds fascinating. Welcome, Professor Alexandrov. Thank you so much for joining us. And I look forward to hearing your presentation. So I will turn it right over to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you, everyone, for zooming in. The book, The Black Russian, came out 9 years ago. I finished researching it 10 years ago, but I still love revisiting it in webinars and in talks, because the experience of writing that book literally changed my life. I remember very clearly how it all began for me. I was preparing to teach a graduate seminar, as Lauren mentioned, on Russian emigre culture between the two world wars, and I was reading the fascinating memoirs of a Russian singer, very popular in the 19-teens and 1920s, still popular today in Russia, by the name of Alexander Vertinsky. And Vertinsky described how in 1919, he escaped from the Bolsheviks in the south of Russia during Russia's civil war and wound up in Constantinople, which is what Istanbul used to be called, which was a safe haven for people escaping from the Bolsheviks, because in that period, Constantinople was occupied by the victorious Allies. And then Vertinsky wrote the following sentence in Russian, which I'll translate for you, preserving the idiom of the time. He said, "I began to perform when I landed in Constantinople in the outdoor entertainment garden of our famous Moscow Negro Fyodor Fyodorovich Thomas, the owner of the famous Maxim in Moscow. Now, this so surprised me that I remember I put the book down. I knew something about the period in Russian history and culture, and I knew that Black people were extremely rare in Russia. In fact, then and now, if you ask a reasonably well-educated Russian to name the most famous Black person in Russian history and culture, they're likely to name someone by the name of Abram Ganibal or Abraham Hannibal. But he lived in the 18th century, which means that from the end of the 18th to the beginning of the 20th, there were simply no famous Black people in Russia. So I was intrigued immediately. And like anybody who's curious about some new fact that they've just discovered, I decided to start by Googling it. Nothing turned up. So I used a Russian search engine, and what turned up when I entered that sentence in Russian was the source that I had read myself. But I was intrigued and I began to dig in Yale's very rich libraries. And what I discovered after some pretty serious digging was very limited and very contradictory. But I also had a gift ahead of me, which was something that we professors are given at times by generous institutions like Yale, which was a year-long leave. And I decided to dedicate as much of that time as I could to figuring out who this enigmatic Black person that Vertinsky had mentioned actually was. I began by going to work in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. I began to find little strands of information. They led me to Coahoma County in the northwestern corner of Mississippi. They led me to do research in England, in France, in Russia, and by proxy, because I don't know Turkish, in Turkey. I even had a lead to something in Rio de Janeiro, and had it panned out, I would have gone there as well. And at the end of a pretty serious period of digging, I was able to pull together a surprising amount of information. I say surprising because one can frequently find fascinating sounding individuals, but not find any kind of a paper trail. But I was able to find one in archives and libraries in these different places. And so the real name of the person that Vertinsky called Fyodor Fyodorovich Thomas was Frederick Bruce Thomas. And I discovered that he was the son of former slaves in Mississippi. And when I discovered facts about his family, I began to understand how someone from his background could have had as remarkable a life as he did, because his parents turned out to be completely remarkable people. They had been slaves until the Civil War ended, but in 1869, they managed to buy at auction a 200-acre plot of land in Coahoma County in Mississippi, and to become farmers. Now, to put this into perspective, around this time, there were maybe 250 farms in Coahoma County. Only 6 of them were owned by Black people, and the Thomas farm was the second largest. This is the farm on which Frederick, my subject, was born in 1872. Moreover, his parents turned out to be exceptionally skillful farmers, as the 1870 census shows, because what they paid for their 200 acres of land was $6 and change per year for a period of 3 years. Land property was land costs were very low in this part of the South following the Civil War. But the 1870 census evaluated their holdings at $5,000 of that period. In other words, they managed to increase their holding, their investment, by several hundredfold very quickly. So that was one thing that made them quite remarkable. Another thing that they did that made them stand out was that they donated a few years later 3/4 of an acre of their land to found an African Methodist Episcopal Church. From the research I did, this was probably only the second AME church in Coahoma County following the Civil War. Now, as you probably know, Black churches in the South were not merely places of worship. There were frequently schools. They were places where social and political events could take place. And that is where Frederick, born on that farm, as I mentioned, in 1872, acquired the rudiments of his education. Moreover, it's very likely that he got them from his stepmother, a woman named India, whom he considered to be his mother because they were very close. So the family stood out in terms of their commitment to their fellows and in terms of their economic success. But by 1886, Reconstruction was over. The white power structure in the South was resurgent, and Black families that stood out were in peril. And that's what happened with the Thomas family. A rich white planter, whom the Thomases knew well because they had had business dealings with him for over a dozen years, decided to try to steal their farm from them using a ruse. Initially, they were prepared to acquiesce because they thought they could trust the man. But after mulling it over, they discovered that he was trying to, in fact, cheat them of their land, of their property. And they did another remarkable thing that surely influenced their son, Frederick, as he was growing up and watching this. The Thomases took this rich white planter to court. Moreover, they won on the local chancery court level, which was really quite unprecedented. The man was several hundred times more richer than they were, had all kinds of lawyers at his disposal. They didn't win necessarily because this was a moment when truth and justice were on the ascendant in Mississippi. It was because they were fortunate in being able to find a lawyer who opposed the lawyers that the rich white planter had employed, and the lawyers fought it out. And the Thomases were lucky that their lawyer was better at this game than the planter's lawyer was. The planter didn't give up. He took the matter to the Mississippi Supreme Court, where the case dragged on for a number of years with various movements for and against the Thomases. But by this point in time, the late 1880s, Mississippi had become, as historians have described it, the lynchingest state in the country. And the Thomases decided to get out of harm's way. They gave the remainder of what they had to their lawyer as a retainer and moved to Memphis, which was the nearest city that was still close enough for them to be able to keep an eye out for their property. That was Frederick Thomas's first taste of urban life. And actually, after moving to Memphis, he never went back to rural life. He always lived in cities. He got some more education there at a normal school for Black children, for Black youth. But that's where another tragedy hit the family in the form of a gruesome murder. His father was brutally murdered by a tenant that the family had taken in. When I first discovered this in Memphis newspapers, when I was doing research in the main library in Memphis, I assumed that this was somehow the dark deed of that planter in Coahoma, but I wasn't able to find any kind of evidence of that. I think it was simply bad luck because Frederick Thomas's father was a very decent man. He got involved in a domestic dispute with a Black couple that was living with him and his wife, and the husband in that couple avenged himself by murdering Frederick Thomas's father. And this put an end to the family's life. The family split up. Thomas decided to take off on his own. And this is when he also began, Frederick Thomas decided to take off on his own. And this is also when he began systematically to break the mold for what young Black men in the South did in their lives. Because Thomas went north, first to Chicago and then to Brooklyn, which was not part of New York City at this point. This was decades before the beginning of the Great Migration. when hundreds of thousands of Black people left the South for better opportunities in the North. Both Chicago and Brooklyn had very small Black populations at this time. The opportunities were better for Black people in the North, nevertheless, and Thomas began a career in what we could call now perhaps the service industry. He became a waiter and a valet, and he started off at a very high level in both of these professions, because one of the first jobs he got when he was in Chicago was at the newest hotel that had been built in the city in preparation for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the Columbian Exhibition, as it was called. I'll show a picture of it later together with some other slides that I've got prepared. When he moved to Brooklyn, he became a valet to one of the biggest entrepreneurs in the field of vaudeville in the entire New York City area. So from an early age, he was exposed when he was on his own to high levels in these professions that he pursued. And of course, he was limited in what he could do, because although the North was more tolerant than the South, it still severely restricted what Black people could do to make a living. Thomas also had a passion at that time, possibly a reflection of the musical culture that he would have been exposed to in the AME chapel that his parents had founded on their land, and that was singing. He had a German emigre voice teacher, and that voice teacher suggested to him that if he wants to continue to train as a singer, he would have to leave the United States, because the color line in musical conservatories in the North and elsewhere in the country were such that Thomas would never be accepted. And this led Thomas to doing another thing that broke the mold for young Black people in the United States, because he went to Europe. He expatriated himself. And this was, again, several decades before Black American musicians, artists, and writers began to expatriate themselves, especially to Paris, in the hope of finding greater creative freedom. It was very easy to travel abroad in those days. You didn't even need a passport. You simply bought a ticket and went. And that's how Thomas wound up in England. For the next 4 years, he traveled across Europe. He never actually pursued a musical career in London or anywhere else. He thought he would be doing it in London. I have not found any convincing explanation of why he didn't do this, but I think given how willful and successful he was in general, that had he really wanted to pursue a career in music, he could have done so. And the fact that he didn't pursue one suggests to me that he didn't think it was really the right path for him. So, as I mentioned, Thomas had two professions, both of which proved to be very portable. You could be a waiter or a valet anywhere in Europe. And over the next few years, these are the early and mid 1890s, Thomas went from England to various places in France, to Germany, back to France. He learned French very well. I found testimony by an American reporter who ran into him in Monte Carlo that Frederick Thomas spoke French with a very pure Parisian accent. In fact, he got so fluent that for one season, he was made the maître d'hôtel in a French hotel on the Riviera, which meant that Thomas was put in charge of French and Italian waiters who would have been the normal staff for a place like this. Monte Carlo is also apparently where Thomas caught the eye of a traveling Russian nobleman. Now, Thomas's recollections of how glorious this person's rank actually was varied with his moods later on. He even mentioned once that the individual was a Grand Duke, a term that's used for the sons and grandsons of Russian emperors. I wasn't able to confirm this. I actually looked through various Grand Ducal memoirs, hoping to find reference to somebody like Thomas. I didn't find them, but it is clear that he was hired by somebody who was well off to go to Russia, not a place that he had actually thought of originally, but he went as an employee of some well-placed person in St. Petersburg, the Russian imperial capital. He decided after that he wanted to go off on his own yet again. And he chose to move from St. Petersburg to Moscow. And that's where he began to transform into what I called him in my book, and what the book is titled, The Black Russian. Because over the next dozen years or more, from 1900 to 1912, and then to 1914 and 17 years that I'll mention again because of the significance of those dates, his life curve, if we can put it that way, constantly ascended. Things kept getting better and better for him. He began as a waiter, as he had in Western Europe. He rose to the position of a maître d'hôtel at a fashionable restaurant in Moscow. Then he rose even higher when he became the assistant to the owner of one of the swankiest restaurants in the Russian Empire, a place called Yar. It's a place to which Rasputin would love to come when he was in Moscow during his various visits. And Thomas made so much money via tips. Russians were big tippers. He was very good at his job, that he was able to pool his money with two Russians who had also worked their way up from the restaurant floor as waiters to take over a failed entertainment garden in the center of Moscow. They got it in 1911, they opened it in 1912, and within a year, the place had become one of the favorite destinations for Moscow's night owls, people who would want to go out and spend a fairly long evening and part of the night at some place with various kinds of entertainments and various places to eat and drink. The place was called Aquarium. It actually still exists in the center of Moscow, although it's smaller than it used to be. And during the first year of running this place together with his partners, each of them made in today's money about $1 million. So it was a phenomenal success of a kind that Thomas could never have had, or probably even imagined having, anywhere in the United States. Things continued to go well for him. He married a young German woman in Moscow. They had 3 lovely children. I'll show pictures of them later on. He moved the family into one of the fanciest new apartment buildings in Moscow. The building also still stands and is still a very impressive and desirable place to live. The amount of money Thomas was able to make from the aquarium allowed him to take over another failed establishment that's also in the center of the city, which he ran on his own. It was called Maxim. It was a kind of a combination nightclub and theater. There were, incidentally, places called Maxim everywhere in Europe, following the original one in Paris. So for him, things were going extremely well. Unfortunately, however, the life curve of the Russian Empire was declining, to put it in symmetrical terms. From 1900 to 1914, there were strikes. There was a revolution in 1905 that resulted in artillery fire in the streets of Moscow. There were multiple assassinations by terrorists of imperial grandees. When the First World War began in the summer of 1914, Russia, of course, joined on the side of the Allies, but wasn't prepared for it. So the Russians suffered grievous losses. The strain on the economy was enormous. Shortages of food and fuel appeared. Revolutionary stirrings got even more serious in the country as a result. So although things were going well for Thomas, the country was beginning to start to fall apart. During the Great War in Russia, the government announced a form of prohibition. And it succeeded in Russia about as well as prohibition would in the United States a few years later. In other words, hardly at all. A lot of people made a lot of money hand over fist by selling illegal alcohol. Thomas was a practical businessman. He saw that everybody around him was doing the same thing, and he did as well. So he made so much money from this that by 1917, a crucial year in Russian history, by the very beginning of the year, he bought an entire block of apartment buildings in Moscow. They also still stand. They're also still in the center of the city. And before that, he invested some of his money in a villa in Odessa on the north shore of the Black Sea. At any rate, everything changed in 1917. The first revolution in March was a relatively mild one. A sort of populist socialist government came into power. The mood of the country changed. Thomas managed to adapt to it and to change the kinds of entertainments he put on in his establishments. So that was fine. But when in November of 1917, the Bolsheviks carried out their coup d'etat against the so-called provisional government, everything changed. And Thomas woke up to discover that he was on the wrong side of history, because the Bolsheviks were Marxists, and they didn't care that Thomas came from an oppressed minority in the United States. What mattered to them is that he was rich, and he had become a capitalist by virtue of his business success. Moreover, by this point, Thomas had also acquired Russian citizenship. So he was incidentally possibly the first Black American to become a citizen, maybe even the only one, of the Russian Empire, at least in this period. At any rate, Thomas was perceived as a class enemy by the Bolsheviks, together with others of his sort. His properties were seized by the regime and, in the terminology of the time, nationalized. Thomas was left with almost nothing except for a small cafeteria for theatrical workers that he was allowed to continue to run. He found out by early 1918 that he was likely to be arrested. This was a period when the Soviet secret police tried to arrest and eliminate anyone that they thought might conceivably be an enemy of the new regime, which resulted in an exodus of Russians who didn't want to live under the Bolsheviks in various directions. Thomas and his family fled to the south. Now, for historical reasons that I don't want to get into, so as not to clutter what I'm saying with too many details, Odessa, that city on the Black Sea coast where Thomas had a villa, was in German hands at this point in time. So by escaping to Odessa, Thomas and his family were able to escape from the Bolsheviks and still remain in familiar territory. He stayed close to a year there. When the Great War ended, the French took over the area around Odessa that had been in German hands. This was a very welcome development because the French and various other Western powers were militantly opposed to the Bolsheviks. In fact, hopes grew that on French territory, like in the south of Russia and other places similar to that, anti-Bolshevik movements could develop that would move north and knock the Bolsheviks out of power. But it didn't happen. The Bolsheviks continued to march on these various enclaves. And by 1919, the situation became so dire that Thomas had to flee yet again. This time, it would be across the Black Sea to Constantinople, as was mentioned before, which was a safe haven because the Allies had taken it over since Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, had been on the side of the Central Powers during the Great War. So the city was administered by Britain, France, Italy. The United States sent a naval squadron to the city as well. The Americans had not actually fought the Ottomans during the Great War, but they were still enemies. And so the Americans wanted to be in this important occupied city together with the French, the Italians, and the British. And Thomas arrived there after getting out of Odessa with enormous difficulty with something like, as he remembered later, $25 in his pocket. I was able to calculate using various charts and so on how much he was worth when he had to leave Russia in terms of the properties that he owned in Moscow and in Odessa. And it was conservatively around $10 million in today's money. So that's the fortune he lost. And he arrived with just his family. In fact, not even his entire family. He lost a daughter in the chaotic evacuation of Odessa. But what he had, if he didn't have any money, was a skill that turned out to be really needed by the people who had taken power in Constantinople, namely the victorious allies. Who were they? They were officers, sailors, businessmen, and bureaucrats, mostly male. And what they wanted during the time that they had free from their various labors as they were preparing to partition the Ottoman Empire, which was the plan to divvy all of it up and to give various parts of it to the victorious allies, what they wanted more than anything as a form of entertainment was basically wine, women, and song. And there wasn't anybody in Constantinople at the time who had the kind of experience in providing the kind of entertainment that these occupiers needed and wanted than Thomas. Now, I don't want to suggest by saying women in the sequence of things that he was anything like a pander, far from it. But he was very used to putting on vaudeville shows and light operettas and farces in which there would be singing and dancing by attractive women on stage. And so that's what he began to do. He borrowed money from merchants at usurious rates, 100% for 6 months, for example, and he was able to open his first place in the summer of 1919, which is where that Russian singer with whom I began performed to great acclaim. Thomas was successful there as well in Constantinople. He had to move his operation from one location to the next until he eventually found a winterized property in the middle of the European part of Constantinople near Taksim Square, which for any of you who know the city will recognize. It's a central square on the European heights of the city. He opened a place that he renamed Maxim, and Maxim became the toast of Constantinople. When tourists began to come back to Constantinople and the eastern section of the Mediterranean and so on, and visited the city from the United States or from Great Britain, they all wanted to do the same few things. It's something that all tourists, when they come to Istanbul, want to do now. They wanted to visit Hagia Sophia. They wanted to visit the Sultan Ahmet Mosque, go to the bazaar, the Grand Bazaar, and also in those days to go to Maxim, Frederick Thomas's celebrated nightclub in the city. Now, that wasn't the only aspect of Thomas's life that's worth mentioning here. When he left Russia, when he escaped from Russia by the skin of his teeth, he lost all of his papers. He needed to be recognized somehow by some power when he was in Constantinople, and naturally he turned to the Americans who were there. But the Americans refused to recognize him as an American. They didn't know that he had actually given up his American citizenship when he became a Russian citizen. That's something I was able to figure out by looking at various archival documents. But from his appearance and the way he spoke, they should have accepted him as an American. Where else could he have come from? They refused to give him American papers. I dug into that when I was doing research in State Department archives, and I discovered that the reason was pure racism. The Americans resented the fact that he had been successful in Russia. They resented the fact that he had a white wife. This was his second wife by this point, and 3 mixed children, mixed race children with him. And they simply either lost his applications for recognition as an American or claimed that they didn't believe what he was saying about his own past. it was an egregious case of racism. Now, this was a real problem for Thomas because in 1923, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, ended, and a Turkish Republic was proclaimed. As a result of which, all of the allies were forced to leave. Their plans to dismember the Ottoman Empire failed due to the efforts of Mustafa Kemal, subsequently known as Atatürk, father of the Turks. And this left Thomas in a kind of a limbo because he had been a successful businessman during the Allied occupation, but with the occupation over, he wasn't a legally recognized individual any longer because he didn't have any kind of nationality. He managed to succeed by using stand-ins, Turks apparently, who worked with him and who represented him to the new Turkish Republic. But it wouldn't last. He couldn't compete against other ventures of the same sort that he had successfully developed. He overextended himself by about 1927, which is the period that I've reached in my story. He went bankrupt. He tried to escape from bankruptcy by leaving Constantinople for the new capital of Ankara, but he was arrested and put into debtor's prison in Constantinople, a prison that dated back to the Middle Ages with brutal conditions in it, where he fell ill. He had had pneumonia a couple of times before and died in the summer of 1928. By this point, he was financially ruined, as was his family. He was taken in as a charity case by an order of Catholic nuns, and they arranged for a funeral service for him in the local Catholic French cathedral, which still stands. He wasn't a Catholic himself, but that's how it happened. And he was buried in the French Catholic cemetery in Istanbul, which is also still there. But since there was no money for any kind of a tombstone, the exact location of his burial is not known. But I found in the cemetery's records the fact that he was buried there in 1928. The family that he left had a very rough time of it afterwards, except for one son, his oldest son, born in Moscow in 1905, a man by the name of Mikhail, who managed to get to Prague, which was very Russophilic at the time because of the president of the Czech Republic, Masaryk, and eventually wound up in Paris. I was able, in a complicated way, to find that son's son. In other words, I met and interviewed several times Frederick Bruce Thomas's grandson in Paris. The grandson, of course, never knew his grandfather, who died decades before. But that's one of the sources of the information that I was able to use in putting together the story of Frederick Bruce Thomas's life. I wish there were more time to describe some of the other remarkable things that he went through, but I thought that it would probably be best to give you a brief overview of his life in the hope that it would interest you enough so that you would perhaps want to read the book and find out more about various aspects of this remarkable trajectory. So I'm happy to answer questions, of course, but first I thought I would show the PowerPoint presentation that I have, since in this case, as in all others, pictures are worth hundreds of words. So I'm going to shift to sharing my screen. And I hope everybody can see that. Are we good?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So first I have some stock pictures. These are simply from various sources to show you what the Delta looked like in those days. It doesn't look at all the same anymore. It was an extremely wet place with sort of islands of land in between swamps and streams and lakes. And of course, the Mississippi was the reason for this because it flooded its banks every spring. I mention this because it suggests something of how difficult it was to farm this land. and of course the farming of the land and the raising of the crops that made this part of the country extremely rich, made the white people extremely rich. It shows how difficult it was to work the land, and all the labor was obviously done by slaves. The area where Thomas was born, where his parents had a farm, had only been settled by white slave owners some 40 years before his birth. The swamps had to be drained, the trees cut down. The labor was very difficult, but this was the result. The Delta, as this area in Coahoma County is known, produced an enormous amount of cotton, and it made the white planters very rich. Now we're leaping ahead to 1890. Thomas has left the South, he's moved to Chicago. I mentioned that he worked at the fanciest new hotel in the city, the Auditorium Hotel. It still stands. It's on South Michigan Avenue. It's now Roosevelt University. And it was very interesting to go into the building and to see what it looks like, because it's what Thomas saw as well, especially the topmost room in the hotel, which used to be the dining room, which is where he worked. Now this has been transformed into the university's library, but the decorations are still there. So one can see what Thomas saw in that place. This is a photograph of him from the early 1890s that I found in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, when he was already in Europe. And this wonderful photograph of him showing the same cap is one that his grandson, whom I met in Paris, very generously let me use in my book. It shows how handsome Thomas was, but I won't bother trying to go on about that because you can see that, of course, for yourselves. I mentioned that Thomas caught the eye of a visiting Russian in Monte Carlo. Thomas was working at the Hôtel de Paris at that time. That is a contemporary photograph of the place. It stands just across from the casino in Monte Carlo, and it was as grand then as it is now, showing the level at which Thomas worked when he worked as a valet and a waiter. This is a photograph of from around 1900 when Thomas got to Moscow, of what Moscow looked like in those days. It was a very low-lying city. The tallest structures that you see pointing up in various places are for the most part church steeples. If you look in the top middle, you'll see a dark kind of brick-colored band with towers rising up, surrounding a series of white buildings with towers. That is the Kremlin, which was then and still is, of course, the heart of the city. This is another shot of the Kremlin from the river. You can see in the left middle the fancifully shaped and colored cupolas of the famous cathedral in Red Square, and the red brick walls of the Kremlin. One of the towers was painted white. At one point in time, the entire Kremlin was painted white, but that, of course, is now changed. The cathedral, obviously, is St. Basil's, that you will all recognize as kind of a symbol of Russia. This is a major street in downtown Moscow at the time, showing that most of the buildings were at most 2 or 3 stories high, and that what dominated the skyline from almost any street in the center of the city were churches. In fact, if you look at an old map of Moscow from around 1914 or so, there was hardly any place in the center of the city where you would be more than a block or 2 away from a church. There were that many of them. A lot of them were destroyed in the anti-religious campaign by Stalin in the 1930s. This, however, is a different thing altogether. It's the place, the restaurant Yar, Y-A-R, where Thomas rose from being a maître d'hôtel to being an assistant of the famous owner of the place. It was at the time one of the grandest and most famous restaurants in Russia, and also very well known in Europe. In those days, when you arrived at a place that was famous, you wanted to feel that you arrived someplace magnificent, which is why it was rebuilt in the way that it was here, with enormously high ceilings and cupolas and so on. This is a favorite photograph of mine that shows Thomas with his two partners in 1911 when they took over the aquarium garden. Excuse me. The two men, as I said, had worked their way up from the restaurant floor like Thomas. They were self-made men. And I don't know whose dog that is, but it's a wonderful symbol of where Thomas was, because it's a Russian Wolfhound, a Borzoi. I might mention that this photograph doesn't appear in my book because it was sent to me after my book came out by somebody in Moscow who came across my book and who's a descendant of one of the two men sitting next to Thomas, a man, but his last name is Tsaryov. Unfortunately, this descendant, other than having this photograph as a memento, knew nothing about his ancestors' relations with Thomas, except that they had some. But he let me use the photograph, and I was able to put it into the translations of my book that have come out since the American edition was published. This is what the entrance to aquarium looked like. It was very grand. Again, the whole point was if you arrived there, you would want to feel that you were someplace special. And what awaited you inside? There were theaters that operated during the winter that were heated. There were band shells that operated during the summer. There were lots of places to eat and drink, simpler, more fancy, various kinds of games that you could engage in as well. And it was a place that would open in the evening and stay open during the summer most of the night. The Russians, as the rest of Europe at that time, liked to revel into the early hours of the morning. And this is where Thomas became very successful initially in Moscow. This is an advertisement for his property, the Maxim, in a theatrical journal that I found in a library in Moscow. It shows him, given his Russian name. Russians love to Russify foreigners' names. So Frederick Bruce Thomas became Fyodor Fyodorovich Thomas. Russian teachers still do that with students when they take even elementary Russian at Yale, for example, just as a way of making them seem somehow more involved in what they're studying. And there's a list of a couple of dozen acts, including some from the United States, as well as from the rest of Europe. The kind of default program would have been vaudeville, everything from trained animals to ballerinas, to violinists, to gymnasts, and so on. This is an artist's conception of what an upscale space in Maxim looked like. There's a couple doing what looks like a Spanish dance, and well-dressed ladies and gentlemen sitting around enjoying champagne while a band plays. I found this photograph of Thomas and his family with his second wife in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. His second wife is the woman on the left. His three very attractive children by his first wife are in the front. I was never able to identify the two other men in the photograph. I'm guessing that they must have been his second wife's relatives. This was not a happy marriage. It was a marriage of convenience, and it soon failed, in part because Thomas met and fell in love with this attractive German singer and dancer, Elvira Youngman, who also appeared in much more demure guises, but she was well enough known for a German publisher to run off these postcards of her for her many fans. Here she's actually dressed up for an American cowboy and cowgirl act that she performed with her brothers, even though they were Germans. It turns out that at the end of the 19th century and to this day, American Westerns are very popular in Germany. Anyway, she became Thomas's mistress and then wife. And I'll show you later, bore him two sons. I wish I had time to get into this more, but Thomas knew and brought to Moscow Jack Johnson, the black heavyweight champion of the world, the first black heavyweight champion of the world. He was going to put on exhibition bouts in Moscow, but the Great War that began in the summer of 1914 prevented that. This is a remarkable document because the scribble in blue in the upper left is the word agreed, written by Emperor Nicholas II on a petition to allow Thomas and a group of others to be accepted as citizens of the Russian Empire in May of 1915. A couple of studio shots of Thomas around 1915 looking very prosperous. These were also sent to me by a Russian in Moscow, different from the first, who also happened to have a couple of these photographs in family memorabilia. But again, he couldn't tell me anything about how they came to be in his possession. Thomas in Odessa. Odessa was a very Europeanized looking city. This is a famous landmark, the Richelieu steps that descend from the top of the city, from the city itself down to the shore. I found a photograph of the ship on which Thomas was able to get out of Russia, terribly overcrowded, designed for some 300 people, but over 800 people, refugees packed in like sardines. This is a contemporary photograph of the Istanbul side, the old part of the city of Istanbul, Constantinople. It actually still looks pretty much the same from a distance. But Thomas put down his roots and began his businesses in the European part of the city, now known as Bayolu. In those days, it was Pera. This is the Grande Rue de Pera, now known as Istiklal Caddesi. Looks very much the same. There's even a trolley car that goes down it, and now for tourists to ride. I wasn't able to find any photographs of Thomas's entertainment venues, except for this kind of artist's conception. And you can see in the upper right, a stage with a dancer in a skimpy outfit. On the left is a bandstand. And in the foreground, with their backs to us, are civilians and military watching the performances. This is an advertisement from an English language newspaper that appeared in Constantinople when the British were the occupiers. It mentions Thomas, it mentions his new property near Taksim Square. It mentions the fact that he had introduced jazz, and he, in fact, can be credited with bringing this enormously influential and popular music to Constantinople for the first time. And he was in the good graces of the occupiers, as the text at the bottom of the advertisement indicates, because the British allowed their officers and even their families to dance in his establishment every day, which meant that these were proper establishments, ones that would not somehow compromise the honor of a British officer. This is Elvira as his wife around 1921, when Thomas made an attempt to apply for for recognition as an American citizen and get an American passport, which I described as something that was denied him. The young man on the right is his son, Mikhail, the one who eventually wound up in Paris and whose son I met. These are the two sons that Thomas had by Elvira, Frederick Jr. and Bruce. Again, photographs taken in preparation for an application for a passport. And this is the cemetery where Thomas was buried when his life fell apart. As I said, there is no indication of where in that cemetery he's buried. But I've been talking to some people that I know about the idea of putting up a plaque on the cemetery wall to commemorate the fact that this remarkable man was buried there in 1928. When Thomas lost his nightclub, the Maxim nightclub, it was taken over by Turks and survived as a major venue for popular culture in Istanbul, especially jazz and Turkish variants of jazz for the next 60 years, I think. When I was there in 2009, the remnants of the decoration of that nightclub were still visible, as you can see here, even though the place had been transformed into a squalid parking garage. So this is how it was then. Now even this is gone because the entire building has been torn down and a Sofitel hotel has been put up in its place. And here I want to throw in something that's not in my book, but that I discovered also from people in Russia who got a hold of me after my book came out. I discovered that Thomas had another affair that I never read about before with a woman who belonged to a prominent merchant family in Moscow, the result of which was this lovely girl on the left, Lydia. When Thomas left Moscow and when he left Russia, she stayed with the mother's family, and she grew up to become an artist, a respected artist in the Soviet Union. She died in 1997, so not all that long ago, actually. This is a typical painting by her in her characteristic style, which I love especially because it shows her father. She couldn't have remembered him well enough to paint him from memory, and the depiction of him is obviously something that she took from photographs, including some that I showed. He's shown sitting next to his wife, and she's shown sort of facing us next to her mother. What's interesting is the table setting, because you can tell from the shape of the white-colored pyramidal structure and the brown cylinder that this is a Russian Easter celebration. These are characteristic foodstuffs that would have been created for that occasion. Here's a self-portrait that she painted later on in her sort of kind of very harsh but expressive fashion. And she's had something of a little, of a kind of a renaissance recently, because last year at a fairly prominent museum in Moscow, there was a retrospective exhibit of her work that was the result of the efforts of a man who particularly admires her legacy. She was well treated in the Soviet period. She was allowed to travel not only around the Soviet Union, but abroad. And she left a mark in Russian art. The text on the right is a brief summary of her life and also mentions my book, because apart from my book, For Ill or Better, there aren't any sources of information about her father. At any rate, let me then end with a plug for my book. This is from the Shameless Commerce division of this presentation. My book is available on Amazon. And if you want a signed copy of the book, you can order it from Atticus in New Haven. They will get it once it's reprinted. And I can come in and write pretty much anything in it that you may want to see. So I think I'll stop now, stop the share, and say again that I would be happy to field any questions if anybody has any.
Wow, what a fantastic presentation, Professor Alexandrov. Thank you so much for that. I just am amazed at how you were able to roll off all the major events of Thomas's life just off the top of your head. I can't tell if you have notes, but it looked like you're just telling the story, which of course is really a testament to the great deal of research that you've done over such a long period of time.
I have given a talk before.
We have a lot of questions coming in, and before we get to the questions, I want to just make a call out to the book. Here we go. Virtual background was trying to swallow my copy of the book, but it is really a wonderful read. And so I'm going to follow you up on your shameless self-promotion and say, if you don't have a copy of the book, please do get yourself this. You can be the envy of all of your friends who will probably not have this book on their bookshelves unless you buy 2 copies and give them one too. So that's also a great idea of something you can do. The book is not in great supply on Amazon. I actually think our Yale Alumni Academy community has purchased most of the last copies of it that were available on Amazon. And due to supply chain issues, which I'm sure we can all relate to at this point, we're back ordered with the publisher. So if you want to order it from Atticus, that's a wonderful source. You can also just email us at alumniacademy.yale.edu, and we will make sure that you get a copy of the book when it's available. So if you'd like a signed copy, Atticus is a great option. You can also just send us an email and we will put you on a list of people who have pre-ordered the new batch of copies coming in with the publisher. Okay, I want to go to some of the questions. We have so many questions, and we have about a half an hour left to go through them. I would really encourage you, please, to put your questions in the Q&A box, because those I can keep track of more easily. I want to go to Tim Weeks' question because I think it gets at what's a really important undercurrent to this story, which is how race is treated in different parts of the world during this era. You know, obviously Thomas's sort of life trajectory, had he stayed in Mississippi, could have been very, very different. Had he stayed and had he survived sort of Jim Crow Mississippi, would have been really different. Had he stayed in Chicago, had he stayed in New York, than how it was for him moving, you know, to so many different places. And obviously he found himself in a number of interracial marriages. And so Tim just wants to know about how that might have been viewed in Russia at that time. And I note that the paintings that you showed of his daughter who became the painter, when she shows herself with her mother appears to maybe have some African descent in her. So I don't know if that's the case, but if you could speak about that topic, would be really interesting.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a great topic. It's central to the book, and I'm glad that it was raised. So what happened when Thomas got to Western Europe is that he discovered, as other Black people from the United States did also, including Ida Wells, for example, the great figure from Memphis, who visited England roughly at around the same time, that there was no bias against Black people in England or France, quite the opposite. I mean, the Brits were racists with regard to Jews, for example, or South Asians. But the only people who objected to Black people in England at this time were visiting American tourists. They would come home from a trip to England and they would write to their local town newspaper editor that you won't believe what I saw at a fancy place in England. There was a Black man and a white woman dining and nobody cared. So Thomas, as other Black people who arrived in the 1890s in Western Europe, discovered that there was no bias against people like him. In France, I even read he was considered to be especially attractive. When he got to Russia, it was in a sense more of the same. Thomas subsequently mentioned more than once, as I found, that he encountered no color line in Russia. Russia, and especially Moscow, were actually Moscow is a multicultural city. Moscow is at the crossroads of continents, and there were people in Moscow from the Black Sea Basin, from the Caucasus, from Asia, from Central Asia, in sufficient numbers so that somebody like Thomas did not, in fact, stand out as much as we might think. It's interesting about his marriages. I have evidence from the family, from the merchant family, with the daughter of from that family with whom he had that girl, Lydia, the child. The family could tell me very little about the actual relations of Thomas with their ancestor. She does look darker skinned in that painting, but there was no reference to her being anything but the daughter of a prominent, well-off Moscow merchant family. But what's particularly interesting is that the family has a kind of a collective tombstone on the outskirts of Moscow. And mentioned, engraved on the tombstone, are various members of that family, including Frederick Thomas, and including a photograph of him that was printed on an enameled medallion. It's a photograph very similar to one of the ones that I showed in my presentation. This is something that Russians liked to do and still do. They will take a photograph of the deceased, put it onto a ceramic medallion and affix it to the tombstone. And Thomas is listed there as the common law husband of the young woman in the merchant family with whom he had the child. They remembered him fondly, despite the fact that he was not really a father to his daughter, and he left her and the entire family when he left Russia. Moreover, Russians have this practice of referring to people by their patronymic, in other words, by the person's first name and by a variant, masculine or feminine, of the father's first name. And this girl, Lydia, is known and was known as Lydia Fyodorovna, which means Lydia, daughter of Fyodor. And Fyodor, of course, was the Russian version of Frederick Thomas's name. So that's, I think, evidence of the fact that Thomas was accepted. Moreover, there's other stuff I could say about that. Claude McKay came to Moscow, the famous poet, some half dozen years after the revolution. He encountered no color line there as well. But let me move to Turkey, because that's yet another element in this interesting story. The Ottoman Empire was multinational. There were Black people, people from all over the vast empire, who had positions of authority in the Ottoman court. Turkish, at this time, the Ottoman language, as it's referred to, didn't even have a special term for anything that used to be, Negro in Old English, or even Black. They would call anybody with a dark complexion Arap. So in the 1960s, when Black Americans came to Istanbul, they discovered the same thing. There was no special recognition of them as somehow being markedly different. The way in which the Ottomans divided the world was not by skin color, but by religion. They didn't care that Thomas was black-skinned and had a white wife. What mattered to them is that he wasn't Muslim. And then after that, they didn't care, because the Ottomans were actually quite tolerant religiously, as we know. So yes, the story of Thomas's life involves his moving through a whole series of very different constructions of how to understand people and where they belong. And American constructions of race were by no means the ones that he encountered elsewhere, except, I repeat, from visiting Americans. When Americans came to his place in Moscow, Aquarium, they would be surprised to see that the American owner of this place was a Black man. And they never responded to him in the way that one would expect. You run into somebody from your homeland very far away, and you sort of express pleasure and surprise. There was surprise, but there was no pleasure. So Americans took their racism with them in their luggage when they traveled.
It's a really interesting point that you make, especially when you think about how, as you say, into the 1960s, there wasn't really a recognition of that kind of difference. It calls to mind that perhaps, the perceptions of race in America have been an export to Europe and other parts of the world, wherein they weren't native perceptions in those places at the time. So it's really interesting to think how he could sort of move through society with color not being an issue.
Well, it changed, unfortunately. I mean, in Russia in the 1960s, under the Soviets, there a whole university to educate youth from the so-called Third World was established, Patrice Lumumba University, known as Friendship University. Lots of students from Africa came as well, and Russians developed a homegrown form of racism. And it is the case that there is still a bias against dark-skinned people, whether they're from America, Africa, the Caribbean, or for that matter, Central Asia in Russia. So unfortunately, this relatively pristine Russian attitude toward Blackness has not survived. And we can't forget that the Russians may not have thought of Thomas in any negative way, but they were notorious anti-Semites at the same time.
Yeah, I'm glad that you raised that point, because a number of people had asked actually about Russian racism and how that evolved in the context of Thomas's story. I want to go to another point though, because it's something that you draw out in the book, but that you didn't get a chance to talk about as much as coming up in the questions, which is Thomas's sort of mastery of the language and how difficult it is to, not necessarily so difficult for an English speaker to learn French per se, but for an English speaker to learn to navigate in Russia and speak Russian would be probably pretty difficult, and likewise, to then move to Constantinople and have to pick up another set of languages, because of course, both of these cities, Moscow and Constantinople, were, as you say, sort of international cities. So there would have been multiple different kinds of languages being spoken, and I wonder if you could just address his mastery of languages.
Sure. No, that's another good point. Thomas never learned Russian perfectly. There are some records of how he spoke it, and he made lots of mistakes, but he could make himself intelligible. But what helped him in Russia in his line of work, which was fairly sophisticated entertainment as an impresario, and even more so in Constantinople, was that his French was fluent. Because at this point in time, French was the international language, the way English has become now. So Thomas was able to get by in Russian well enough to rise very high in the pecking order of businessmen of his sort in Moscow. I didn't mention this, but in 1917, just on the eve of the collapse of the empire, he was elected to membership in the first Guild of Moscow Merchants, which was an honorary organization for people who were players in the Moscow business world. And Moscow was a rich city with a lot of people who had clout and money, and he was inducted into it. Moreover, his daughter was as well, Olga, his oldest child. So obviously this wasn't an impediment to his success that he didn't know Russian perfectly well. He also had a pretty good command of German, from what I can gather. And so using the French and German, he was more than able to get by. But the other thing to mention here is that it wasn't just that French was the second language or the first international language at this time. It was the second language of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were used to the fact that nobody spoke Ottoman, Turkish. And so all of the elite and even the merchant classes had French. And Thomas's command of it was perfect. So he had very little trouble. Only when the Republic was proclaimed in 1923, and there developed a turn against this kind of kowtowing to foreign tastes, did he start running into some kind of trouble, because there were requirements that signs be in Turkish on establishments, and if they were in a foreign language, it had to be smaller font, that kind of thing. I don't think he learned more than a smattering of Turkish when he was there, because he didn't need to.
Well, and I thought it was remarkable the scene that you described where he's working in a hotel in Monaco, I think it was, and an American businessman comes in and he's speaking to Thomas in English, and he's so thrilled that Thomas speaks English, but Thomas's English is sort of the very stereotypical Black English of the South from the 18th century, with a kind of a broken English that we would have seen in old films, for example. And then he says, oh, he's speaking this, this type of English, but it's refreshing for me to hear this. It's comforting for me to hear. And then Thomas starts speaking French, and his French is like, a world apart. It's sort of perfect French. And he can't reconcile how this man can be have so much facility in one language and not in the other. I thought that was a real fascinating juxtaposition.
I suspect that newspaper reporter that you're referring to actually, to sort of give his story about Thomas some kind of more punch, exaggerated the sort of Southern style of speech that Thomas had, because nobody else who encountered Thomas, whether in Moscow or in Constantinople, I mean Americans who encountered him, said anything like that. Yes, he had a Southern accent, but it wasn't as egregious as this particular reporter did. So I think he was just trying to play up to his readership at the time.
Oh, that's really interesting. Well,
Yeah.
this is why I love these book talks, because we get to bring out these points and really hear your thoughts on them. I noted that Lewis asked for he missed the first 5 minutes of the presentation, so I want to remind everyone that this presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Yale Alumni Academy website for viewing on demand, as will links to where you can get a copy of the book. But you can also always just email us at Yale Alumni Academy if you would like a signed copy of the book. I also, just while we're on the topic of language, Minta asks about American media announcers learning to pronounce Vladimir correctly. So since we're all here and I'm looking through the questions while I find the next one, you can tell us how to pronounce your name correctly.
Vladimir works in English. In Russian, it's different. It's Vladimir, but that's hardly something anybody ever tries. So I'm perfectly happy with Vladimir.
There we go. All right. Well, I'm not going to try it today, but I will try it for a future occasion. I want to go to some questions about we only have 10 minutes left with you. I feel like we could talk for another hour. But questions about your process, because this story is as much, I think, about Thomas as it is about the adventure that you went on trying to learn about him. And I'm fascinated by these people in Russia who heard about the book and started sending you pictures and saying, I don't know who this guy is in the picture with my dad or my uncle or what have you, but I think you might be able to use this. Really interesting kind of a inquiry into this man's life that led you in all different directions. And someone has asked if you could just talk a bit more about your research process. What was it like to try to find a needle in a haystack? Were there any letters or diaries that you found from Thomas that may have helped your story?
Yes, there are letters that I found in the National Archives. Incidentally, I gave my website at the end of my talk, and there is a long blog that I used to produce when this book was recently just recently out. I think there are a couple of hundred entries that discuss some of this stuff in detail. But the short answer is it was an absolutely fascinating process to try to find information about Thomas. I got completely addicted to the search for information because I felt like I was a detective. You'd find one little strand. Sometimes it would lead to an entire ball of thread. Sometimes it would peter out. I became expert at digging in the National Archives. One of my most important finds was a reference on an index card to a file that said Thomas, Frederick B, death of. And I figured, wow, I have to find this. And I went to the archivists, very helpful usually. One of them spent the better part of 2 days looking for this file. And he says, well, it must be one of these ghost references to something that no longer exists. So I shrugged my shoulders, went home. I made about a half dozen week-long trips to the National Archives over time. And I began to dig through the labyrinthine, PDFs and websites that the National Archives had. And lo and behold, I come across a reference to something known as the Cutter file, which seemed to be what I was looking for. To make this long story short, when I went back, I was able to use the information I dug up, and they gave me a folder with 75 pages of information about Thomas, including the transcription in 7 typed pages of his oral narrative about his life. So it was one fact after another. That's how I found out about Clarksdale, Mississippi and Friars Point. That's how I wound up going there. I was able to confirm every last detail that he mentioned, because there were some Americans in Constantinople who tried to help him, even though the State Department wouldn't recognize him. And so all this stuff was kept. I found all kinds of wonderful things in France as well, letters that lawyers wrote about copyright infringement that they were accusing Thomas of. Yeah, so I found letters in his own hand, not very many, but I found them. So, you know, there are worse addictions to develop than to archival research, I'll tell you that. Yeah.
Yes, I understand how indeed get addictive, and I think that this is a worthwhile endeavor to get addicted to. Um, uh, you talked about the State Department just now, and there was a question on that. Let me see if I can find it. Yep, from Michael, who says that your revelation of the atrocious behavior of U.S. diplomatic and consular officials in the book is only the tip of an iceberg. Is there any chance that you might pursue that in the future or have a student do so?
No, I mean, it's a very rich topic. Somebody should write about this if they haven't already. I keep coming up across it or encountering this fact in different kinds of books. Larson's famous book, The Garden of Beasts, about the American ambassador who was sent to Hitler's Germany in the sort of mid-30s, I think it was, also describes the rabid anti-Semitism of the State Department at this time. So it's a known fact that this was a nasty operation, depending on, you know, for various groups of people. But no, I'm not going to work on that myself. As Lauren mentioned, I've started working on the next book, which is about Russians in the American Civil War. Let me just mention one detail from that to see if it gets any kind of interest from people. The Secretary of the Navy under Lincoln wrote in his diary in 1863, "God bless the Russians." Now put that into the context of what's going on today to get a sense of what kind of things are going on then, which is why I'm so eager to continue to work on the new book. At any rate, let us not digress again and come back to Thomas.
Well, we'll have to have you back for another talk, or perhaps you can teach a class as you're working on your new book. I know alumni love to join classes with professors, and professors love to have an opportunity to work out their research projects with alumni. So I think we are definitely inviting you and welcoming you to do that. And you are also being invited in the comments. A couple of people would like to see you at the Miami Book Festival. So, and anyone who has written comments, we will be sharing the comments thread with Professor Alexandrov after this is over, because he can't read them all right now, but I'm sure he'd like to see what people have said. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I want to get to a few other points if we can. Dominique wants to know Lydia's full name so that we can see more of her art for people who are interested in learning more about her art. Would you share how they could find that?
Yeah, so you'll be able to see the slide in the PowerPoint when the recording is posted, but it was Lydia Fyodorovna Arkhipova. Arkhipov was the last name of the merchant family that embraced the memory of Thomas and the family that raised this young woman.
Thank you for that. And then a couple of people have sort of pointed to, you know, we know that sort of during the 1920s and during the jazz era, there developed overseas communities of Black expats who found exactly what you're describing. They found that Europe was much more welcoming to them than their home country. And so I'm going to butcher this name, I hope not, but Adedana wants to know if Thomas's story influenced Paul Robeson's decision to go to Russia decades later. And a couple of other people want to know if he influenced other Black artists in Europe and Russia at the time.
Those are all very interesting questions. I don't think so. I don't think that he influenced very many Black people, because knowledge of him in the United States when he was successful in Moscow, and then when he became successful for the second time in Constantinople, was very restricted. To whom? To the tourists who happened to pass through his establishments, but who sometimes remembered him less than fondly because he was Black. As one example, a woman from some southern state who went to the Maxim nightclub in Constantinople wrote one of these letters to the local hometown newspaper, where she referred to him as being, and you'll pardon my repeating the idiom of the time, a very polite Negro who treated me the way a Southern lady wants to be treated. Now, Thomas was a savvy businessman, and he wasn't going to offend the customer gratuitously, but that's not the kind of word of mouth that results in the celebration of a Black American who has succeeded phenomenally well in two very different countries like Russia and Turkey. He did have Black performers who performed on his stages. Some of them had track records afterwards. Some of them disappeared from the historical record. And they did talk about him. I remember coming across a letter that a song and dance act, two guys wrote to one of the Black newspapers, either the Amsterdam News or the Chicago Defender, about how pleased they were to see a successful Black man in Moscow. But again, that news was restricted to the Black press. So in other words, there were obstacles to celebrating Black achievement in the United States at the time. They were even more serious when they dealt with Black achievement abroad. So I think that the example that Thomas presents to us now was not one that was widespread in his life. And he couldn't get out of the country. He couldn't go to Paris because he didn't have papers. And he didn't have papers because of the races in the State Department. He wanted a passport so he could travel, but he couldn't.
So it's so interesting. That point just kind of brings the crossroads of so many different factors of this story together. You have to ask, if it hadn't been for the racism in the United States at the time, what might he have done living in the US? But then at the same time, that very much shaped his work in the hotels and restaurants and establishments that made him so well equipped to become the impresario that he became. And would he have ever gone overseas and gotten that widespread cultural exposure if it hadn't been for the racism in the South?
That's right. Yeah.
And yet that's also what led to his ultimate decline, that he couldn't go back home and he couldn't get papers. So he's a man who's both sort of made by racism and destroyed by racism at the same time. It's a really fascinating story.
Yeah.
You can do so much more with this in your television series, which many people are asking about in the Q&A and the chat. So you must go back and tell your producers that the over 200 people who turned up today want to know when they can watch this show, because I've gotten at least 4 or 5 questions about that in the chat.
I'd like to know too. All I know is that it's progressing. I trust the people involved. I hope it doesn't go off the rails. I wish I could share some of the details that I do know, but I have been sworn to secrecy, so I'll have to honor that.
Yes, you all will just have to watch your Netflix and Amazon and HBO subscriptions to see which one of these networks turns up with the story of the Black Russian. Until then, you can feel free to rewatch this presentation, and I encourage you again to order a copy of the book through Atticus or by emailing us at alumniacademy@yale.edu. Thank you so much, Professor Alexandrov. This was a fantastic presentation. Do you have any parting words before we sign off?
I'm happy to field questions from people via email, for example. So my email is readily findable. And if you want to ask me something that wasn't addressed, drop me a note and I'll be happy to reply. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about the book.
Excellent. Well, we will see everyone on our next Alumni Academy presentation. We have 2 more webinars happening this month, so please check out our website and register for those that are interesting to you. And I hope that you all have a wonderful experience exploring all the things that there are to learn during this Black History Month. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.